From large cities to rural communities throughout California, the Pacific Northwest, Arizona, Nevada, and Idaho, JP Morgan Chase believes impactful business starts with shared visions. Our community development banking group is dedicated to crafting customized solutions, helping you navigate complex, multi-layered financial deals with clarity and precision. Together, we make purposeful visions possible. Because when your goals are built on a breadth of resources and foresight, they have the power to fuel economies and empower healthy communities.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today for Housing California's second annual conference and our 42nd annual conference. My name is Shioni Flegel. I'm a managing director at PolicyLink, and I'm joining you today from the unceded territories of the Chochenyo Ohlone peoples. I'm thrilled to see you all today as we start this conference. I have the privilege of serving as the chair of the Housing California Board of Directors, and I want to start by thanking our sponsors, our staff, my fellow board members for pulling together this unconference. It's a huge endeavor. We have huge gratitude to the conveners, the speakers, the partners, and everyone who took time from their busy days to lend their insight and expertise. And a huge thank you to all of you for joining us in this journey. Before we officially launch, I want to share a couple tricks and tips to ensure you have the best possible unconference experience. During the sessions, feel free to chat with other attendees in the chat box and use the Q&A box to ask questions of our speakers. For more tips, the user guide and your best friend, get to know it. It's your first stop when you have questions is the Whova app that I hope you all are using. You can also email us at conference@housingcalifornia.org. That's conference@housingca.org. I hope you'll all take a few minutes to visit our virtual exhibit hall, which follows the sessions. You can win prizes, participate in the exhibit hall passport activity. Please post on Twitter, on Facebook, and help share the experience and join the conversations we're having as part of this exciting event. You'll see the Housing California team live tweeting sessions, and you can join them in the conversations there. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are on the heels of Juneteenth. So thrilled to finally see this holiday recognized by our federal government, reminding us both of the dark history of our country and the enslavement of our African-American brothers and sisters, and the delayed emancipation that many of them experienced. We have so much work to do still. We have come a long way, but we still have so much work to do as we finally see the light at the end of this pandemic. We know that it has taken a toll on the lives of so many of our fellow Californians. We've lost more than 60,000 people since this pandemic began, and over 1 million Californians are still out of work. These are our neighbors, our relatives, and our friends, many who struggle with homelessness and are facing housing insecurity. As the housing moratoriums, eviction moratoriums loom in front of us, we know hundreds of thousands of households still don't know whether they'll be able to stay in their home or risk eviction. Our thoughts go out to all of those who are struggling, and we know our thoughts are not enough. It's part of why we are so excited to have you all join us in this conference. This is a place for us to hold a shared vision and to come together to exercise our collective power for change. For too long, we've given the majority of power and authority to the wealthy. We've not lived into this moment to do better, and we hope that you will all use this as an opportunity to join the work, to really follow the call into collective action. This is our moment to advance together. So let's use the next few days to walk on the path towards advancing racial justice, making the case for a bold housing agenda, building the base of support, repairing, reforming, and transforming California as a state with homes, health, and wealth for all. We look forward to moving through the unconference experience with you. I have the true honor of introducing Elizabeth Elliott, the Executive Director of the Northern Circle Indian Housing Authority. Elizabeth will lead us in a special opening ceremony designed to help ground us in the moment, open our hearts to racial reconciliation, healing, and transformation, and open our minds to think about homes, health, and wealth in a more expansive, inclusive, and holistic way. Elizabeth, I hope you can join us now.
Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Elliott, and I'm standing on the occupied territory of the Southern Sierra Miwok Nation. I'm here this morning to challenge you to look at homes, health, and wealth through an Indigenous lens. In order to mitigate homelessness, we must acknowledge the history that founded this country. Let's start from the beginning. This nation was founded by immigrants who fled oppression, trauma, and colonization, only to create a nation that was a reflection of the abuse they faced before they arrived here. We are taught about the greatness of our nation and the hardships we overcame. However, we are not taught about the structural violence that continued on for BIPOC communities. We all learned in school that the preamble states, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice to ensure domestic tranquility." As I've grown older, it has become clear that it should have stated, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, established supremacist policies." If we are being honest with ourselves, the Declaration of Independence should have said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that only men who look like us are created equal." The pandemic showed us that the equity these founding documents promised for all never actually came to fruition. This year taught us that we as a nation have never taken the time to make amends with the communities that we hurt the most. An example of our nation not healing is that Juneteenth is now a federal holiday, which means that only a certain class of people will be able to have the day off. Whereas the members of low-income Black communities who are impacted the most by slavery will never get a day of rest. This is yet another example of how COVID-19 flushed out disparities that we as a society have been trying to hide since 1776. We saw this through the Black and brown lives that were lost this year to police brutality. We saw this as the coronavirus killed more Indigenous community members per capita than in most states. We saw this as thousands of people hoarded items with no regard for the rest of humanity. Are you ready to give up America's zero-sum mentality? I am begging you to change the narrative around wealth. We need to stop valuing money and material items more than human lives and human rights. We've lied to ourselves for centuries, believing that money brings happiness. Real wealth is clean air, clean water, the land, the mountains, the trees, the animals, the birds, the bees, and love for all of humanity. Think about it. Until the pandemic came, we did not realize how valuable nature really is. We need to shift the narrative to rewrite our legacy so that we can make this world a better place for the next 7 generations. Indigenous people hold ceremonies to pray for all of mankind. Indigenous communities have been under government control for 193,016 days. Indigenous communities have never been set free from that control, forced to shelter on reservation boundaries, yet many of us have struggled sheltering in place for just 453 days. This is not a moment. This is a movement. It is time to rise up to ensure all Californians have the same rights as you and me. Let's be honest, the system was designed to make BIPOC communities the enemy. In order to bring homes, health, and wealth for all, we have to eliminate racism so that we can have equity. You have the ability to influence legislation and policy changes so that no community is left out. This is our moment to make hope and history align. That means that no one should have to choose between their health or obtaining basic necessities. We have to care for our unhoused community members just as much as we care for our own family. Equity is not simply building homes for people. It's knowing the systemic conditions that led to the lack of homes for those people and doing everything in our power to mitigate those conditions. We need to acknowledge that privilege isn't the absence of perks and benefits, it's the absence of obstacles and barriers. Those things are harder to notice unless you focus on the alternative experiences of those around you. We have the power to shift the narrative, as long as we are willing to operate with humility to right the wrongs of history. So join me on this journey. We're going to change the nation by putting our love back into all communities. So as you go through this conference, I pray that your heart and ears are open. I pray that you find the understanding in the importance of our work to come together. I pray that you begin to see the inequities, and in doing so, a fire ignites within you, fueled by justice and equality for all people. Before I go, I wanted to leave you with a song from the Quetzal Dihe Nation about bringing our souls back home. Luti, 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 saltu my luti. Luti, 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 saltu my luti. Luti, 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 saltu my luti. Oh, consider this conference the start of our new year as we begin our roadmap home. I pray that next year we're able to return with the news that all Californians have housing equity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for grounding us in such a powerful way this morning and for calling on each of us to join this experience with intention and awareness. Next, I'd like to introduce Housing California's Executive Director, Lisa Hershey, to say a few words and bring us into the opening keynote. Lisa.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Shioni Elizabeth, for starting us off so strongly. I'm honored to join you today from Cree Lands, today known as Sacramento, California. In my couple of minutes with you, I hope to accomplish three things. One, to thank you for joining us on this journey. Second, to offer a call to action. And third, to introduce our title sponsor and my dear friend, Cecile. So first, thank you for joining us on this journey for this week and for the long game. We are in a historic moment in our housing justice movement, in pandemic recovery, and in the world around us. We have a choice in this moment, like many before, to either lead with fear, experience anxiety, and even paralysis, or we can lead with love and hope, step in, step up, and achieve transformation. I encourage you to take a moment this time while we're together in community to pause, breathe, reflect, and connect with each other as we travel on our roadmap home with open hearts and a commitment to creating our California with homes, health, and wealth for all. Second, this morning, I offer you a call to action. The good news is we've gotten this far because of great support from all of you in a large coalition, which has resulted in including $1 billion of ongoing funds for homelessness, potentially in the budget. Today, I'm making a special request to ensure that the final budget includes this critical funding. We need calls to Governor Gavin Newsom now to let him know Californians need an ongoing commitment. Every call counts and will greatly help our communities. Budget negotiations are happening now. So I'm going to offer you quickly the 2 steps, and then my colleagues are going to put them in the chat. So when we have our break this morning, after you visit the exhibits and do some chatting with other folks, I want you to dial 916-445-2841. Press 1 for English or 2 for Spanish. Then press 6 to speak with a representative, and stay on the line, or press 3 to leave a message. After the beep, your message is going to sound something like this. My name is Lisa Hershey. I'm from whatever city or county, in my case, Sacramento, California, and I'm calling to urge Governor Newsom to include $1 billion in ongoing funding as part of his total package to address homelessness. Thank you for making the commitment to our communities and for making homelessness a strong ongoing priority. And lastly, this morning, keeping that action in mind, it is my absolute honor and pleasure to turn the stage over to my dear friend and partner, Cecile Chalafour, representing JP Morgan Chase, one of our longtime co-title sponsors, to share a few thoughts, introduce our exciting headlining opening plenary, and welcome our special presenters this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome you all at the Housing California Conference, hopefully the last one we're not together. I'm very excited to see us all working collectively to put together a bold plan to create the future we want for California with Roadmap 2030. Lisa asked me to share a personal memory, something we discussed together. I remember in the early 80s in France, seeing how different countries, different Western countries, made very different policy and society choices. I remember the protest. I remember the fears. I remember the hopes. I even remember the songs from that period. It was a very complex time and one that shaped the world we live in today. We're 40 years later. We're at another crossroad, one when we need to make bold decision again about the future we want for our societies. I'd like to quote Jamie Dimon. Something he said in the shareholder letters this year. The raw power of America is often represented by our incredible military might. In reality, however, our raw power emanates from our economic vitality and strength, which have always been predicated upon freedom, free enterprise, and the promise of increasing equality and opportunities for all. If income inequality is a fault line, returning to the basic morality at the core of America's founding principles can lead us to a common purpose and help bind us together again. We will start the morning with a kitchen table talk with Dr. T and Heather McGhee. Heather McGhee is a New York Times bestseller author of The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs and How Can We Prosper Together. Dr. T is a dynamic speaker, best-selling author, and the president and CEO of The Case Made, who is helping leaders intentionally and powerfully make case for system change. So grab your coffee or your tea and enjoy the conversation. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Well, thank you so much. I want to first of all just thank Chioni and Elizabeth and Lisa and Cecile for powerfully bringing us into the space this morning. And I will say that for those of you who came here this morning ready for a powerful conversation that puts us on the course for bold action, you are in the right place at the right time, and you got the right two, I would say, policy narrative strategists to have this conversation. Heather, I want to just welcome you into the Kitchen Table Talk. It is a pleasure to be with you as a colleague and friend. I'm so excited to see not just the reception that the book is getting, but to see you everywhere, which is amazing. And I'm so excited to kick this conversation off. So let me just give a little context to that. I really want to just hand it over to you to talk to the hundreds of folks on the call right now, but the thousands of folks who we expect to see the audio and video as produced and sent out. This conversation is really meant to share your perspective and writings in the hopes that it inspires more people who are doing the frontline housing work across California and maybe even across the country to address this sort of zero-sum thinking that pervades housing policy, and to really help us to wrap our arms around a narrative that gets to what you call the sum of us and can offer us some of those solidarity dividends. I wrote about a paper about some of the issues that were challenging us in terms of housing messages several years ago, talking about zero-sum thinking and a whole series of issues called You Don't Have to Live Here. And what I love about your book is you take this on, you give lots of examples, not only in the housing context, but fundamentally across the overarching, I would say, march of our shared cultural history in this country in such a powerful way. And I'm excited because there's a possibility of having lots of housers on this call who think, breathe, love housing policy, know it back and forth. We get in our circles and we get all sort of, thinking about the solutions that we want to propose in our communities. And then we get opposition, and it's challenging. And one of the things I'm so excited about having you here for is to help us understand that sometimes opposition to some of those housing policies, it's not a rejection of the ideas that we're producing. It's this thing that gets in the middle, which is the zero-sum thinking that you talk about as dividing us. And so, because this is a conversation about how we build public and political will at a moment that is absolutely critical, I'm so excited to have the audience of Housing California's Unconference be able to hear your perspective. And I invite you to start us off with a little bit about what made you write the book, what brought you to this conversation, and really the insights that bring, right, such a powerful narrative and conversation to us today.
Hey, thank you, Dr. T. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you to all of the housers, I love that term, who are gathered here with Housing California. Thank you to Elizabeth for that beautiful, beautiful invocation and grounding. I'm coming to you from across the United States in Brooklyn, New York, in Lenape, Canarsie land, and really just feel very privileged to be a part of a conversation that is connected by this bold policy goal. So often as the language of crisis becomes our everyday language about things as essential and intimate and necessary as home, there's a feeling that we don't have solutions, that there's nowhere to go, that it couldn't possibly be any better. And that's why I think that the Roadmap 2030 is so powerful, to be able to say, yes, we can do this, we can afford this, we can't afford not to. We are not just going to lurch from crisis to crisis, we are going to make the future together. So congratulations to all of the people who are a part of designing that roadmap and are a part of advocating for it today. So to answer your question, Dr. T, why on earth did I write this book? I had a pretty good job. I loved my job. I helped to build. I was hired as an entry-level economics sort of policy associate when I was 22 years old at a think tank called Demos, and I worked my way up, went to law school actually at Berkeley, and then went back to Demos and was president for 4 years. And I felt like we were doing good work, right? We'd identified a lot of the big issues that were causing and driving economic inequality and inequality in our democracy, and we were making progress. And yet it did feel like ultimately the entire progressive movement, the entire movement against inequality and for justice and equity, had these headwinds that we couldn't name, so we couldn't put a handle on, that nobody had ever made a unifying case about what was standing in between us and progress. And yet it felt like across so many fields, housing, healthcare, workers' rights, what was going on with what would become the financial crisis, student debt, all of these issues, there was something that unified our causes that we weren't really talking about explicitly and didn't have a handle on. And so I made the kind of unexpected decision to transition out of my role and hit the road, and traveled hundreds of miles, thousands of miles over 3 years. Spent time in California, Mississippi, Maine, back again many, many times, and identified that it really is this zero-sum thinking, this idea that progress for people of color has to come at white folks' expense, the idea that we are locked in this head-to-head competition in a racial hierarchy. It's an idea that is more prevalent among white Americans, that people of color, generally speaking, don't think that our progress has to come at the expense of white folks, but it's an idea that's been sold by a very narrow, self-interested elite for its own profit in order to create the political coalition that has blocked economic progress and equity and brought us the inequality era. And in my book, I talk about the sort of central story of the drained public pool. What happened to a country that had invented the idea of the American dream, that had created the greatest middle class the world had ever seen, and the highest standard of living in the world, based on a shared ethos that government had a right and responsibility to provide for a decent standard of living for its people. And for me, the public swimming pools that were part of this sort of New Deal era of public goods, public libraries, roads, schools, bridges, of course, but also things like Social Security and wage and hour laws and collective bargaining laws, things like the GI Bill, and massive, of course, investment in housing, both the creation of housing units for workers and the miracle that was working class folks being able to own their own homes. All of that was part of a massive commitment to public goods and to the idea of middle class security for people who frankly had never dreamed they could have attained it. And yet all that I just described was either explicitly or through often implicit ways and in implementation, virtually racially exclusive for whites only and segregated, including those public pools. And once the civil rights movement really empowered Black and brown families to say, hey, those are our tax dollars that have been funding those public goods. We want our kids, in the case of the pools, to swim too. Many towns across the country drained their public pools rather than integrate them, literally drained out the water, backed up truckloads of dirt, seeded it over with grass. In The Sum of Us, I tell the story of going to Montgomery, Alabama, which once had 1,000+ swimmer pool in the heart of its, sort of central park called Oak Park. And instead of integrating the pool on January 1st, 1959, the city of Montgomery closed it, drained it, closed the entire Parks and Recreation department of the city, sold off the animals in the zoo, kept the Parks and Recreation department closed for a decade rather than integrate it, meaning that everybody lost out, that the community itself lost a gathering place. And even after they finally reopened the parks in 1970, they never rebuilt the pool. And so I use the story of the drained pool to describe what happened across our economy at the end of the civil rights era, when faced with a government that had quickly gone from the enforcer of the racial hierarchy to the upender of the racial hierarchy. We had the majority of white Americans turn their backs on the very idea of government and the very idea of the same public goods that had created their economic prosperity, often invisibly through tax benefits and through an assumption of an ever higher and higher standard of living. They turned their backs on those public goods once the public was no longer perceived by them to be good, once people that they had been taught to disdain and distrust were included in the public. And so as demographic change has created, opened the door for political exploitation and stories and narratives that heighten a sense of group status threat, zero-sum thinking, and resource hoarding, we've had a political coalition that has often chosen the psychological wages of whiteness, as W.E. Du Bois said so memorably in his book, Black Reconstruction in America, instead of real material wages. And as I write in The Sum of Us, really the cost has been nearly universal for people of all backgrounds who are struggling in an economy where 1% of the population owns more wealth than the entire middle class, and 40% of adult workers are paid too little to make ends meet for the basics from housing to food. And that was before the pandemic. I'll just say in my final response to your question, that I also, however, ended my journey to write The Sum of Us in a much more hopeful place than I was when I sort of set out on the journey out of frustration. Because everywhere that I looked, I found the fingerprints of racism in the forces that were holding back progress, the forces that were creating inequality for everyone. But I also found the opposite. I found people and communities who were willing to reject the zero sum, to come together across lines of race and difference, to unlock what I began to call these solidarity dividends. And that's the idea of gains that we can only achieve when we come together in a multiracial coalition to solve our common problems and come up with common solutions. You know, this is a moment where the pandemic has been the most object lesson in the costs of racism to us all, in the ways in which a society that left so many holes in our social safety net, that was built on exploitation and disadvantage, that was built on vulnerability, that had drained the pool of public resources around public health care and workers' rights, left far too many people, Indigenous, Black, Latinx, and others, on the front lines and maximally exposed to what should have been a colorblind virus and threat. And because of that, and because of the official indifference for so much of the pandemic to the lives of people of color and working class people in this country, we have had too many deaths, too much loss, too many dreams deferred, too much debt, and too much anxiety and stress. But we are coming together. And that is really what I'd like to leave you with, is that there has always been a counter narrative to our common humanity. There has always been a force in our politics and our society that wants to keep us divided, distracted, and apart and at odds with one another. And yet the core recognition of our common humanity that the pandemic has elicited, the awareness of the crisis of housing insecurity and unaffordability, and how interconnected our fates are, is the superpower for this movement. And we have to keep running through the doors of this opportunity. It is absolutely time, given our shared vulnerability, to move big, bold ideas that will address the unaffordability of basic shelter and wealth building for all of our families. And I'm just so excited to be invited to be a part of this conversation and this community of people who are dreaming of solidarity dividends in California, and in so doing, as has always been the case, setting a model for where our nation is headed. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Heather. That is outstanding. And I love the way you ended that, sort of dreaming of solidarity dividends across California and the nation. I think that is exactly right. The audience that you have in front of you, you're right. I think we're almost up to 1,000 folks on the panel. on the in the conference right now who are hearing you talk about this and thinking anew about the work that we have to do. And I'd love how you started out talking about the pools and kind of what that represents and the kind of just highlighting the irrationality that often the zero-sum thinking sort of puts folks in, but the alternative of what you're saying in terms of solidarity dividends is really powerful and inspiring for those folks, for those of us who can often get down about the possibility of change. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and just talk about kind of where you left out in terms of COVID-19 and some of the things that are happening now. Let's talk about just the power of this moment, even more so. We're in a moment nationally where there are these sort of bright spots of, just hope and aspiration. Even Juneteenth that Shiona mentioned at the top of our conference as being kind of this little bright spot of the sort of recognition of our shared history and past and the challenges of that, but the power of that. But there's also at the same time, what you mentioned, the COVID-19 and the lingering impacts on BIPOC communities, the challenges to voter suppression and challenges to fair housing enforcement across California and the nation, bans on critical race theory, or just talking about and acknowledging kind of how we got here in this moment. And so, it's challenging on that front, but there's also all these opportunities even in California, right? There's big possibilities and policies on the state. The state has a surplus budget that could ease many of the housing challenges, right? We've got, billions of dollars both in that surplus, but also in federal resources that are coming to the state that could help us address some of the housing challenges that we have. And there's just a whole momentum, I think, across folks in this audience for doing things differently, for being able to show up, pull up to the table, right, and interact differently. So speak to us a little bit more about just the power of the moment, the opportunity that you see, both in California and across the country, to do things differently, to pull up to the table with a different attitude and momentum, and even some of the healing work that you talk about at the end of your book. It's just powerful. I just think it's such a good opportunity to just think outside the box of possibilities, and I'd love to do that with you.
Well, I mean, we never could have imagined, 2 years ago, that the impossible, that the way that our society moves, our commitment to our consumer-driven way of life and work, that it would just freeze and stop. Right. We never could have imagined that, right? And I think in the collective break, not as in taking a break, but a break, right? A rift, a rupture of the status quo, there became the space to dream. And I do believe that what we have seen in the national and in the state policy discourse, with frankly ideas that have been at the progressive fringes of society, the people who are most connected to people in struggle, and have elevated these ideas about recognizing the racist roots of so many of our problems, being very clear about the way that racism has held the pen as so many of our laws and policies were written. And that if we don't see that, we can't repair those systems or make new ones in order to make a high functioning society for everyone. That is now a given in the conversations in this administration at the federal level. Not to say that everything is perfect or right, but the fundamental willingness to acknowledge the truth of our history has broken through. We have Secretary Haaland as the head of the Department of Interior, bringing with her the incredible centering of Indigenous life, values, families, land, and community in our most sacred shared resource, which is our natural environment. That is massive. We also have proposals, unfortunately, sitting on senators and congresspeople's desks and not yet signed into law, that would as I say, fundamentally refill the pool of public goods for American families and communities. Universal childcare and elder care, ripping up all the lead pipes in the country. Finally, universal broadband and paid family leave, repair for Black farmers, a massive recommitment, the largest commitment to Indian country, that we have seen in our lifetimes. So many of the kinds of policies that have been on the wish list for advocates are now either in proposal or at least getting a hearing and are part of the discourse. This is the America that we've been fighting for in so many ways, where the terms of the debate are at least honest ones about the scale of our needs. And I would firmly put Roadmap 2030 into that sort of new paradigm of owning up to the scale of our challenges and offering solutions that are anywhere near commensurate to the scale of the underinvestment that we have had over the past 50 years of the inequality era. And it's coming because of movement building. It is coming because the largest social movement in the demonstration movement in the history of the country has fully recast the public conversation in this past year. With Black Lives Matter. It's coming because of the Dakota Access Pipeline and Standing Rock ignited the collective imagination of the country and put water protection into the center of our thinking about the ways in which we have to think about energy and transforming our relationship to the land and to our water. It's coming because of the sacrifice of so many immigrant families and the calling of the moral question about who we are as a people. And I could go on and on. This moment is here because of movements. This moment is here because of movements, which are always have been the most powerful narrative tool that we have to force a moral question and to put issues into the spotlight.
Thank you. Powerful, powerful, powerful. I love it that this moment is here because of movement, right? Movements, right, build the power of the moment. I want to talk a little bit more. You mentioned Roadmap Home 2030. I want to just ask you a couple more questions about that. Just talk through that a little bit, talk through some of the opportunities and juggernauts to get over. For those of you who don't know, Roadmap Home 2030 is a comprehensive effort to literally put a roadmap of priorities in front of legislators to say, we've got some real opportunities here. And as the 5th largest economy, right, Californians are asking us to solve this issue. It's the number one issue. Affordable housing and homelessness are the number one issues across the state. The resources are in front of us in a way that they haven't been for decades. And the imperative coming out of COVID-19 is right in front of us. It says, listen, we have got to solve this once and for all. And so there's all this momentum. And one of the things that's part of the kind of really in the crux of the roadmap work is thinking about the narrative that helps us to bring new champions into this conversation. If this continues to be a conversation that's just about housing and housers, right, we won't get the solidarity dividends that you're talking about. So I'd love to just talk with you about, we've been trying very hard to think about how we pull in hospitals and unions and employers and everybody, right, who has a stake in this issue, but may not always understand it as such. Yep. And it just strikes me, I'm betting that, the sort of solidarity dividends exactly in the center of that conversation could reach. So let's talk a little bit about bringing more people or building the bigger tent, bringing folks into this conversation who right now, this is not a priority. It's not right for them. It's not the way that they think about the things that they got to get done in their own work, but it's central to the shared prosperity of the state. Would love to hear you just talk a little bit about that notion of bringing in the sort of unconventional partners, group sectors into a conversation that right now often feels siloed.
That's right. Well, I think so because of drained pool politics, right? Because of the anti-government, often, racially inflected politics that have had most people with power turn away from the public as a source for solutions, assume that things are as they should be or will always be, look to the market, with its sort of white male dominance as the problem solver for our society's problems, as opposed to a more multiracial representative public. We often have, with issues as big as housing, a sort of collective action problem, where many people who obviously, and institutions that obviously depend on a well-housed workforce and consumer base, on the public investments of housing and transportation and education, not really seeing how it's all connected and what they could or should possibly do to change things, to go sort of upstream from their daily balance sheet, to look at how these public investments and private burdens do and do not shape their own outcomes. And so I thought it was brilliant that in Roadmap 2030, you talked about, Housing California talked about the return on investment, the way that you'd get for this investment in housing affordability and security, $48 billion in wages and business income, $14 billion in more state and local taxes, more than 500,000 jobs annually. It's important that we not get caught in a conversation where we propose a policy and the only number that's given is how much it's going to cost in public money, as opposed to how much is going to benefit the public and the very multidimensional public. So I think that's a really important part of the conversation, to identify all of the benefits, to people who are currently housing burdened, homeless, and at the risk of homelessness, but also to our entire community in any given place. I think it's a huge piece of the puzzle. And as we know, the racial wealth gap, is costing $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion every year. We can start to really use our economic tools to show how, quite simply, if you have so many of your players on the sidelines saddled with insecurity and debt, discrimination and disadvantage, they're not going to be on the field scoring points, right? And so there is a degree to which our entire society is held back by these inequities and insecurities. And then I would also say that so often, and I know this from work that I've done and conversations that I've had with local advocates who are trying to move inclusionary zoning and an end to exclusionary zoning and other kinds of affordable housing policies. So often you'll get the Chamber of Commerce and a sort of, NIMBY, often, white, upper middle class, or, fully wealthy homeowner organizing against the idea of sort of, degrading property values. And I think it's important for us to take on that zero-sum thinking head on. We need to take it on by showing what the community is going to look like when we have won our goals. And it is not, I think it's really important. So often as advocates, we talk about the problem. And we talk, then we may talk about the solution, which is the sort of technical policy fix or the big number that we want to invest. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about the vision and really luxuriating in the vision of what our communities will look like. So it's often very difficult for people who feel like they're holding on to something in the status quo to want to take that leap together into an unknown future. And that's I think the role of storytellers, of advocates, to talk about what our communities will look and feel like when we will have won our reforms and our investments. Who will the neighbors be? How will we, what kind of stores will we have? What will the parks and green spaces look like? For people who work at home or people who work in the service industry? What will commutes look like? What will it look like to work and worship and live and thrive and serve in these communities as they change according to our design? We've got to take control of that future narrative and remind each other that we together make the future.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that. And as you were saying that, I was just about to ask you a question. I think you actually just answered. And the question was, we've got a lot of folks across California who do housing and housing policy in the very formal world of housing policy. Some folks who do housing investments and are, banks and capital providers. And so when you ask them to take on this issue or take on some of these issues, not just around zero-sum thinking, but about issues of race, there are some folks, not all of us, there are some folks who will say, oh man, it's so hard just trying to lift up the issues of housing and then trying to lift up affordable housing. And then Heather, on top of that, you're gonna put on top, now I gotta solve for race. I'm just like, oh my gosh, and they struggle with, can we lift up all of that at the same time and solve for some of that? But I love the way maybe I push a little bit more on that, where you talk about the vision part of that it's painting the vision of what's on the other side of that potentially. I love the word you use, luxuriating in the vision of what could be. Mm-hmm. The book, I love you talk about that in terms of Maine and having Mainers really look at the beauty of what actually could be happening as opposed to complaining about what's happening in immigration. There's something that is happening here that is so powerful, mm-hmm. but it's hard to help unless we help people get to the other side of it. It can be difficult to have those conversations. So speak directly to, the folks in this audience who are saying, I'm a little nervous. I'm trying hard just to lift up affordable housing or some part of it, and I'm getting pushed back and I'm nervous. And now I'm being asked to take on another part of it that makes me even more nervous. Right?
Yeah. Yes, I'm happy to. Well, so I think real talk, when we're talking about affordable housing, we have always been talking about race.
Right.
Always.
Come on now, speak to it.
Right. There was no problem creating thousands of units of affordable worker housing in Richmond, California for white workers. There was no problem creating, cul-de-sac suburban developments, next door in, I'm forgetting the name right now because not Bollingwood, Rollingwood. Somebody in the audience might know. That was whites only for white workers in the 1940s outside of Richmond. There's no problem, right? Thank you, Rollingwood. Thank you, Brianne. That's right. There was no problem with lavishly funded public pools until those also included Black swimmers, and so. I think that is one of the reasons why I wrote The Sum of Us, was because people who are trying to move progressive solutions to economic issues were being thwarted by racial resentment, by unconscious racial bias, and most importantly, by dog whistle politics being deployed by an economic and political elite who want to keep the status quo of inequality, right? And so, race is always in the room. It's a question of, who are we using it for our benefit? Is it being used against us? Are we even conscious of the ways it's being used against us? So there is no public policy that is not determined by public attitudes about who the public is, right? There just isn't. And so that's the first thing. I don't think I'm introducing race into the conversation. I think I'm taking the blinders off about how race has already, always been in the conversation. And the second is, this is where I think, I try to do it in hundreds of pages with some subtlety and nuance, but, the intervention that I'm making in the discourse about how we talk about race and economic issues is that, I grew up in the sort of where the public policy sort of center of gravity of economists and economic policy folks in the Beltway and the East Coast was very much like, let's just talk about wages and housing and taxes and jobs. Let us, we can talk about the disparities in like a racial equity disparity brief, like where we can sort of do an extra thing that talks about, oh, and the problem is worse for people of color, but let's try, because of like a gut level knowledge that it is harder to convince white Americans to move on economic issues when, when the sort of racial parts of it are made salient. That's just been a truism since the politics of racial resentment really became, intertwined with the neoliberal politics in the 1970s and accelerating in the 80s under Reagan. And what I want to say is that if you're trying to create, if your opposition is mainly white Americans or Americans who have sort of bought into the kind of dominant white story about the market and government and people doing it on their own, right? Whatever background they are, but that is sort of the dominant story that has been quite racialized over our history. Then it actually isn't enough to just tell the disparity story. And because if you've got inculcated negative stereotypes about people of color, talking about how people of color are doing worse doesn't necessarily expand my sense of responsibility or make me look to systems. It's just like, yeah, why are people of color always poor? I don't know, not my fault, That's sort of the response. So we've got to remember that disparities don't always do the work that we think that they do. And that's why I try to make the intervention that we have to call out racism, but also call it out as a distorting factor in our public policies that are holding all of us back. Now, obviously, racism always hits its target, right? First and worst. And so I am by no means saying that we should decenter BIPOC communities, certainly not in the coalition building and the movement building, but even in the narratives. But I think we need to finish the sentence and talk about how housing is unaffordable or creates too many economic burdens for working and middle-class families of all backgrounds because of this drained pool politics that has seen us disinvest in support for public housing as our population has become more diverse, or social housing or just public investments in housing as our population has become more diverse. And so it is a both and in a way that hopes to create a broader sense of the we who will benefit from the kinds of solutions that we're advocating for.
Mm-hmm. Yes, love that. And especially the focus on narrative and the pieces of the narrative that are just getting sideways. And I love how you talk about racism always hits its target, but also distorts the conversation in ways that we have to be able to get in front of if we're ever going to move policy work, really meaningful, thoughtful policy work forward. So thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to open it up to Q&A to the audience. So for those of you who've been listening to this conversation and are inspired by it, have all kinds of questions for Heather, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A box. And I'm going to try to get to as many of them as I possibly can. I'm going to start with one that I think you just touched on just a second ago. There are some folks in this audience who are asking questions just about they're tentative, mostly because they're nervous about the idea of sort of multiracial coalitions and how maybe the needs of those, first of all, the needs of BIPOC communities often get sort of narrowed in these larger kind of multiracial conversations, and or the notion that when you join larger forces, for example, in housing, folks who are really advocating for housing for everybody, because everybody California, at every level, you need housing, right? Whether it's low income, high income, middle income, period. Mm-hmm. But they're concerned that when they join the coalitions of folks who are advocating for housing at a larger scale, that it has the possibility and challenge of sometimes muting or at least lessening the voices of those who are most in need and decentering some of these historical racial inequities. And so, talk about you hit on it a little bit, but let's talk, get folks to chew on that. about the balance of how to
Yeah.
think through that, right, at a practical level. Would love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. So, I do this. This is the stuff, right? This is why we haven't done it all the time, right? This is, I mean, many reasons why, but but I think it's also it is a truth that the people most desperately impacted by our dysfunctional systems have to be in leadership, in the policy design, have to be consulted, have to advance the vision. Because then, without it, you won't have the passion and the momentum and the commitment over the long haul, right? And you also won't have the solutions that actually fit the scale of the problem and solve the problem, right? This is the curb cut effect Dr. Angela Glover Blackwell speaks of. It's the idea, I talk about in the book how I'm sort of was suspicious of this trust Black women kind of, shorthand and slogan that was being tossed around, and like, oh, Stacey Abrams, and just like, let's find a Black woman. And I was always like, what?
And I read that and I said, wait a minute, Heather, wait a minute, wait 1 minute now, wait a minute, right? Don't throw the sisters on the bus. And then of course I have read the full thing, but I was like, wait a minute. You're about to throw Black girl magic under the bus here. I'm not happy with that.
That's right, because I did say, I was like, there's nothing inherently magical about us. I mean, but like, no, I'm going to stay with that because it makes, I think it's very dangerous to start to assign, biological, bases for various traits, because it'd be like, yeah, you're magic, but you can't, you can't lead. You're magic, but you can't do math. You're magic, but you know what I mean? Like, just don't define us, like, but I do believe that the people who have been the least served by a system and the most harmed by a system have the best view of the whole system, right? The people at the bottom of the social and economic and racial hierarchies in our systems, have the best view of the entire system and therefore how they need to be fixed. And that's why I think it matters to have BIPOC women, LGBTQ leadership, and have balanced representational leadership, and in our coalitions to center those voices, experiences, and communities, because it'll be the most accurate worldview, view of the systems that are so flawed.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that sometimes when we are organizing in community, we get enamored with small,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because small feels good, right? It feels like you are with people who agree with you, who are your, your kin, your family, your people, and you are fighting the good fight. It may be alone, right? It may feel like you're fighting it alone, but at least, it has integrity. And I think that there are, and as I think it's clear, as I just described that, I think it's really, I understand it, and I have, been in that place in my own career, but I also think that we have to be clear and real about power.
Right.
We have to be real about power. And we have to be sophisticated in our power analyses and actually remember that even, as I sit here as the descendant of enslaved peoples on both sides of my family, none of the emancipatory moments in Black history were accomplished on our own. Right. We always led the fight. We always sustained the fight. We always brought the fight back when, the powers that be lost their focus on the fight. But we never did it alone, right? And so it's a little bit of zero-sum thinking to think that, Black folks were 13% of the population, and, like all the different percentages that we are, that is not 60, right, which is what is needed in Congress, are going to do it on our own.
That's right.
And so, yeah, that's what I would say. But I also think that an honest multiracial coalition, right, not just a sort of table that's been brought together and you have the white folks in leadership and you have, a stilted or untruthful kind of racial story, right? Like I think these multiracial coalitions need to be rooted in the truth and the honesty of the way that racism is required, has created the problem that everyone is there to solve, and be aware of the racial dynamics. But I think it's really important for our people who are not, advocates, who are not, proximate to power and to solution building, that we not let our differences stop our momentum and stop us from actually taking on the real enemy. My friend George Gale says, we found the enemy and it's not each other. And I think that's really important to remember.
Mm-hmm. I love that. We found the enemy and it is not each other. Put that on blast and put that on auto repeat. Alexa, repeat. Put her repeat. But so I love that. And I want to ask a question just to circle back to the issues you talked about in terms of reparations. And you just mentioned that briefly. There's a larger set of questions that are showing up in the QA just about issues of racial segregation. One of the biggest issues in California is just local control kind of fragments good decision making, because you've got communities that have been racially segregated for so long. You've got lots of these little small cities and municipalities that are relatively homogenous and segregated. And there hasn't been a way always to sort of break that up to some extent, right? To have policies that even through zoning issues, right? Because folks were there when the zone and kind of keep zoning the way it is. So it's been really difficult to introduce, right, the possibility of new kinds of housing, bring in new kind of folks, diversify, without taking on those issues. And that's a tough issue. So I'd love to hear you talk about that. I just think that the sort of racial segregation that exists as a function of the legacy of federal and state and local policies for many years has created a dynamic that makes it difficult, especially for communities that already, right, lack people of color, that lack, representation in some way, shape, or form, and just are sort of locked into a way of working that serves the folks who live there, but none of the folks who want access to the benefits of what exists. Mm-hmm. So would love to hear you sort of talk to our folks on this call just about, if we're trying to break through, right, these issues of local control and racial segregation, how can we use, I keep thinking about the narrative of sort of solidarity, mm-hmm. to break through some of that, and maybe even embolden folks to be in solidarity with people who may not already live in their community, right? Because they've locked into right? To be in solidarity with folks who may become folks who come to their schools. That's right. Would love to hear you just talk about that and really help some of the folks on the call kind of understand how to think about it.
I mean, it is the challenge, and I'm not going to claim to have the magic wand, but I do know some of the elements of what is necessary. One is that vision piece, right? If you know what your neighborhood looks like now and someone is saying, I want to change it. Listen, I live in Black Brooklyn. Nobody here, you know what I mean? Like that is real, not just for white folks in Beverly Hills, right? That's real for many people who just are rooted in their neighborhoods and they are worried about what change will bring. And so having the vision of what the neighborhood will look like, I think, ideas like neighbors for more neighbors, the slogan of the campaign against single family zoning in Minneapolis and in Minnesota, I think is the right way to think about the way to, I frankly think the word neighbor is extremely powerful because it suggests not just somebody who lives near you, but somebody who takes care of you and yours and you take care of them. And I think that word is a very powerful word. I also think that it only takes a few kind of traitors from, the political and economic elite to become examples and ambassadors. Yeah. And so much of what we're missing is just the sight of people coming together from different backgrounds and being the face of change and saying, we want this change together, and being willing to sort of just be sort of frank about the racial and ethnic and class issues, and put up people who sort of for and symbolize those different factions in your community, and make the case about why this is good for all, and also make the case about the hidden costs of the status quo. Right? About how much things that are just quality of life issues for most families who are or not thinking about public policy, are often rooted in our dysfunctional housing system and our dysfunctional zoning and in our segregation, whether it's traffic or schools or asthma and smog, whatever it is, it's so often linked to this core dysfunction. And so it's trying to sort of elevate those hidden costs and make the case for the positive win-win. Someone had a question in the chat that I feel like I should probably answer very briefly. That I haven't read all the questions in the chat, but I saw one, and it's from someone I knew when I lived in California, about the tensions that are often within the community of housers, between those who are very rooted in anti-racist praxis and those who are more in the supply, kind of have a supply and production ethos. And I think I think any narratives that are actually dominant and shaping a coalition or a community need to be surfaced at some point, right? And we can only go so long with sort of buried truths. And so, if I were in this community in a very deep way, I would want to have a real discourse around, where the imperatives and incentives for the different sort of segments of the affordable housing community line up and overlap, where it creates tensions, where compromises can be, where the shared vision is, and just call it out, like not in a way that is, not in a way that furthers division, but in a way that creates, reconciliation, right? That creates the coming together, the truth telling, the seeing each other's common humanity, the seeing of, the sort of core decency that everyone in this community has, even though people are coming at the problem from their own lived experience and situation. I think it's important to surface those tensions and have a discourse about it. And maybe it's just like a representative group goes out and, has a retreat and hashes it out and then kind of tells the story to the rest of the community. But I think, no, buried truths do not stay buried, right? They just don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And the ability to do some of that truth telling is part of what folks are trying to do, but it often makes folks very uncomfortable. And so this notion of being able to sit in discomfort, you write about in the book, is a part of the journey. Like that's kind of how you get to like the kind of better opportunity. I want to just thank you for just being so candid and just giving so much of yourself to this conversation that I think all of the folks who are listening right now will benefit tremendously, not just from our conversation, but certainly also from reading the book. And I'll say, from my vantage point, one of the things I love about what you're trying to do is to get people to see the things that are often difficult to see, the things that are baked in culturally to how we function, that we may not even be always present to, right? The things like zero-sum thinking, right? And trying to get people to see those things as part of the way that we work and allow us to get in front of those in a way that captures a whole way of working together that's a lot different. So thank you so much for your time, for your talent, your contributions and expertise. And we are so grateful for having the benefit of your wisdom today. I'm gonna just stop and turn over to my colleague Lisa, who's gonna come in, do a little bit of housekeeping and transitioning us, but certainly I'd love for the audience, if you could, with your +1s in the chat, with your hands or whatever it is, to just give all our appreciation to Heather and your ability to join us today.
And thank you, Dr. T. Really beautiful, beautiful conversation. Thank you so much for all that you do. It's wonderful.
Well, and I want to thank both Heather and Dr. T. I wanted to stand up and do my happy dance right now. This is amazing. We so appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your insights with us today about shifting this current divisive zero-sum game to a unifying sum of us frame so that we can shape this new narrative and chart a more just and equitable future path forward on our roadmap home together. To be perfectly honest, I was a huge fangirl of you both before, and now I'm completely enamored and over the top in respect and admiration. So much gratitude. And before we close out, I just have a couple quick notes. Please, please, please visit the exhibit hall next. Check out our coffee and conversation networking activity. And also want to make sure that folks remember to call the governor, ask him to include our $1 billion in ongoing funding as part of his total package to address homelessness. Last thing before I go, we have this amazing hip hop artist and community activist, Clean, who will be joining us, bringing some of his art to our table, our stage. And then our next session is the Roadmap Home 2030. Enjoy the day, stand up, take a big breath, breathe it in. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the conference.